Monique Gray Smith, welcome to the People's Food Summit.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
I'm grateful to be here today. And we were just talking before we came on that, what a gift it is today to be on Gabriel Island as part of the Nanaimo territory. And this beautiful place here with these two, this goes into a bay here, one of the beaches. And I was just sharing with Danielle earlier that just literally across the bay is a 3,000-year-old, trying to think of the right word, not an indent, but like a carved, specifically kind of created inlet for the Nanaimo people for harvesting and fishing salmon. So I love that, as part of the food sovereignty, here we are with food everywhere around us, as the Nanaimo and often the Coast Salish people say, when the tide goes out, the table is set.
When you're on the ocean, that's for sure. Yeah. So you're from British Columbia.
I grew up in a town called Kamloops, and we've lived in Victoria now for over 34 years. But my mom originally comes from a First Nation in the Treaty 4 area of Qu'Appelle Valley called Papikasis. My grandfather was from the Nanape and Shavetail families, and he was raised outside a community with Frank Cardinal and Mary Fayant. And my dad's side of the family mostly comes from Scotland. And they met on a blind date.
Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, that's great. So have you been writing your entire life? What brought you into this work?
I applied to social work at the University of Victoria in 1994, maybe 93. And as part of my interview, I had to write a personal statement about why I want to be a social worker. And went through my interview, and as I was leaving, one of those women said to me, "I look forward to reading your book one day." And I didn't think she was talking to me. At that point, I was 6 months sober. I didn't graduate from high school. Even though I'd gone back to get my grade 12 and had gone to nursing school, I still had limiting beliefs, so I didn't think she was talking to me. So I opened that door. She said, "Wait, Monique, I'm talking to you. I look forward to reading your book one day." I got out of that room as fast as I could, right? But she did what many of our elders do, is when they see a gift in somebody, they speak that future so that all kinds of beauty and gifts and opportunities can unfold that might not have unfolded if we didn't speak that prayer in some ways, that divinity, that wisdom into the world for the ancestors to come along and help. And so that was the first pebble. It took 20 years of different messages and then a near-death experience before I started to write. And I did a self-published book, and then it was picked up and bought by a publisher. And now it's Tilly, A Story of Hope and Resilience. So it was my first novel.
Really? Wow. Yeah. So that must have been a real self-exploration for you then.
Yeah, totally. It was 2012. I was 44 in my first book. Wow. So, when I meet people who are older, or in their 40s or 50s or 60s, and they're like, "I want to write a book," I'm like, why not? Right? And I say, "How can I help?" So that was the start of things for me.
Okay. And so I saw that you're doing a residency here on Gabriel, and I got super excited. I'm reading your book, Tilly, right now. My partner's daughter gifted it to us.
Awesome.
But the reason that I was particularly interested in meeting you for the People's Food Summit is because of the work you've done with the book Braiding Sweetgrass to adapt it for young readers.
Well, I first read Braiding Sweetgrass in 2015, and it took me a year to read it.
Okay.
Because there were a lot of words I didn't know what the meanings were. I'm not a botanist. I'm not a scientist. And also, just when I read the prologue, I had to put it down or put her down for a month to let all that wisdom find its rightful place. That's why it took me so long to read. Not that I was always going to the thesaurus, but it's like, with the wisdom, you don't want to just push through. It's like, oh, let me absorb that. Let me learn from that. Let that change my cells, or let that remember. That's mostly what happened for me. Was I was like, oh, that's how my mom and my dad raised my sister and I. So much of what she's talking about. And when we visit my dad's family and all the aunts, or the husband's aunts, sister, wives, would be like gardening and harvesting and preserving and talking to the trees as animate objects, and not objects, but as animate. And it was just another way to be in the world that I was like waking up to remembering all of that beauty. And then in 2019, a friend of mine, her name is Tracy Sorrell, she's a Cherokee author, had called me and said, Learner Publisher has bought the rights to adapt Braiding Sweetgrass for young adults. And I just laughed. And I was like, good luck to whoever's going to do that. And she was like, well, actually, I put your name forward. And then I didn't hear anything for almost a year and a half. And then when I did hear, my first inclination was to reach out to Robin. I found her on Google. I sent an email saying, this is a possibility, but I want to make sure that I'm a fit for you. That's my first step. And so we had a Zoom call, and we just kind of like when you came in here, it's like we were visiting and chatting about all kinds of things. And it's like, oh yeah, we got to get back to this. Rob and I had this beautiful connection. And so it was a yes. Cool. And then when the contract was signed, I had 6 months.
Wow.
And I only had 1/3 of the word count. So it was a very intense project.
I bet so, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Well, that must have been, I love that you talk about like building a relationship with the content. And that's something that you mentioned Cardinal and Fayant, those are also good Métis names. And
sure.
In my own connecting to my Métis culture, that's one thing that I've learned from my teachers is how important it is to build relationship. And that's so much in this Western world, we think about consuming, right? And I think to hear you say that that's a different way for me to think about books, which is nice. Building a relationship with the book itself, and taking your time with it, because sometimes this content needs time.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So what were the next steps for you then?
Well, then I had 1 week to come up with the outline of what would be included, including, if you see Braiding Sweetgrass, so this page here, these beautiful braids of sweetgrass by the illustrator Nicole Neidhart, who I just love working with. We've done, I guess, 5 projects together now. This one says, if you ask permission, you have to listen to the answer. So I had to have all those single statements also, and kind of designing the book, like not just the text that I wanted to include, but I wanted the reflection questions. I wanted those sweetgrass braids. I wanted calls to action at the end of each chapter. And the social emotional learning to be really part of the book. As, we talk about consumerism and everything, there goes, I don't know if people see, but one of the seaplanes going by, you might see the BC ferries also.
Yeah, that's how we get around here. One of the ways. When we're not in our kayaks.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that strikes me about this book is, this version of the book, is how this work is so important and these concepts are so important in terms of just if anyone's read Braiding Sweetgrass or is aware of it, there's so many beautiful, profound concepts about reciprocity and connection and how the natural world and our human world coexist and relate to each other, and how important that is for young people. And so this is the focus of this book, is to make it accessible to young people. What in your life kind of helped you figure out how to shape that for young people?
Yeah, and Robin and I say for young and young at heart, because Braiding Sweetgrass is a collection of academic essays, and there wasn't this. The 2 books together provide different access points for different people, as well as the audiobooks. In 2017, I wrote a young adult nonfiction book called Speaking Our Truth, The Journey of Reconciliation. So it's a book about understanding the truth of Canada in regards to the legislations and policies that have done immense harm to Indigenous people and some that still are continuing to do immense harm. And understanding the journey of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And then what are the 94 calls to action and how do we find ways to weave those into our daily activities in life. So that was my first launch into writing for nonfiction and for that age group. And it's funny because Tilly, when she came out, that book won a national award for young people, and I didn't write it with young people in mind.
Right, yeah.
So it was kind of like, because of that award, then publishing companies who were doing young books for young people and children's began to reach out.
Interesting. So I know that you're doing work with the Early Learning Center. No, not early, Outdoor Learning Center.
Outdoor learning, yes.
For educators.
Yes.
For, on this book for educators.
Yeah,
right?
I do a course every 2 seasons. So in the fall, we start actually on Monday. And then there's another series in January. There are 4 sessions, an hour and 15 minutes each session. And I've broken the book into kind of 4 segments. So we work through all of those. So people who are educators, people who are working in the early years, people who are working in post-secondary, families who want to have visits and discussions around the kitchen table. The people who come online, it always boggles me. People say, oh, I'm the CEO of blah, 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 this corporation, and I was really curious, and so, I've blocked these hours for the next 4 weeks, and I'm like, wow, it's not in my cognition who would have come in those ways.
Wow. So in a way, writing a book of this sort for young people has managed to then help reach all sorts of people you would have never necessarily thought you'd reach.
Totally. Yeah, for sure.
So tell us more about kind of what's the heart of this work about?
I think in Braiding Sweetgrass and Braiding Sweetgrass for young adults is the teaching around Thanksgiving, and not the holiday that is celebrated in Canada or the US, but around a worldview, around being grateful for all living beings. That, as you talked about in this capitalistic and corporative society that we live in, is often about me and or humans. How will things impact us? Or maybe not even thinking that, right? Just consuming. And the Thanksgiving in this book reminds us that we are all related. That this cedar tree that we were talking about, wondering why are some of the branches going brown? And we can hear, different birds singing to us. The baby squirrels have been running around lately, which I'm like, you should be bigger than that.
There's a lot of babies on the island right now, actually. A lot of baby turkeys, too. I don't know if you noticed.
But that we are related to every being, including the earth herself. And so it's incumbent upon us to be thankful for all the gifts we receive. Which is, I think, part of why we wanted to be outside for this visit, is because, if you haven't seen the ocean for a while, you're getting, even virtually, a little dose of dopamine and serotonin, and the cortisol, that stress hormone, will come down a little bit. So I think that's a big one. And that Thanksgiving is, as I said, a worldview, because it's like giving thanks for the giving that is to come. Mm-hmm. And when I hear wise people offer prayers, they're not asking for anything. They're always giving thanks. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Thank you for the cedar boughs that allowed me to cleanse the home. Thank you for the turkey that gave up their life so that we may eat and feast in with our families in the next months. There's always that thanksgiving. Thank you for taking care of my partner in healing times, knowing that will come true, right? Thank you for the safe journey today, knowing that will come true. And many times it may involve a gift, right? Where for me in my teachings, that's tobacco. We might lay down that tobacco. If we have to, it's store-bought tobacco, but often it's homegrown tobacco that is very different than what's in the store, none of the chemicals. It's one of our 4 sacred medicines: tobacco, cedar, sage, and sweetgrass. So those medicines are woven throughout this book, but especially sweetgrass. Partly because she is, in many nations, a woman's medicine. the smell that she brings when she's both sitting on a shelf, but also when she's lit it's medicine, right? When I smell sweetgrass burning, especially, it's like all of my cells just exhale. That's how it feels. And even if I'm smelling a braid and just like, it's the same with sage, that the cedar here, they're medicines for us. Mm-hmm. And so throughout this book, Sweetgrass, she makes many, many appearances, because she also reminds us that in that weaving of Indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and knowledge of the plants, alone they bring many, but together it's very powerful. Mm-hmm. Just like if we have all the strands of that sweetgrass, it's powerful. She's powerful. But when we braid her, she's way more powerful. Mm-hmm.
There's a part in the book, and I think, so the stories are they Robin's stories, and you've reworked them?
Yes.
You've put them in your own words, essentially, and
in some ways, yeah.
Yeah, and then added the prompts and added the artwork, and there's one moment where she talks about wanting to be a botanist, mm-hmm. and the teacher kind of scoffing at her for the reasons, something to do with beauty.
Yes, she had wanted to be a botanist, and her first day of college, I think the academic advisor or maybe somebody in the faculty asked her why she wanted to be a botanist, and she wanted to understand why the world is so beautiful. And he said, I think you need to go to the art department. And I think that's part of the beauty of her, is that she is able to remind us to laugh. Mm-hmm. Right, to bring, like throughout Braiding Sweetgrass for young adults and Braiding Sweetgrass, throughout all of her books, Gathering Moss, her new one, The Service Berry, they're all books that I think no matter where you come from in your lineage, there were ancestors who knew how to care for the land, mm-hmm. who knew how to care for each other. And I think throughout all of her writing, she wakes people up to that remembering. One of the key elements of Braiding Sweetgrass for young adults and Braiding Sweetgrass is the honourable harvest. It's about how do we really harvest in a way that upholds the dignity of the plant or the animal, and that upholds our dignity as well. So there's so many teachings within there, right? Like, we never pick the first. We always offer a gift. We never take the last. You use what you've taken, or you gift it, or you share it. There's so many ways of being in reciprocity, that saying, if I have tobacco, yes, I lay it down, but sometimes it's just almost like running hands over the cedar boughs and just saying, thank you for these gifts you're about to give me, that will help to cleanse the house and cleanse any feelings that are in here that may not be supportive at this time. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which I think in these times, those teachings are so important, mm-hmm. because they bring us back to ourselves, and they bring us back to the kindness that we are, I think, as human beings. And in that gifting and in that gratitude, it changes our brain chemistry, and it changes the brain chemistry of whoever or whatever being, right? It just changes the frequency, so that then there is more kindness in the world. And I think we're really in need, mm-hmm. of a lot of kindness in this world right now, and generosity and care and gifting and gratitude. Mm-hmm.
How have you seen in the work you're doing with this book in general, but also the Outdoor Learning Center courses where you're working with educators, how do you see that playing out in education spaces or people who work with young people?
One of the things I often talk about is, if I was a young person coming into your class, how would I feel? Like, what would I see? What would I hear? What would I smell? How would I feel? Because how I feel impacts so much on how I learn, mm-hmm. and how I contribute to being a citizen in the community of the classroom. So I'm like, if you have a whiteboard, you can have nature scenes up. If you don't have a whiteboard and you have a phone, you can have birds singing as learners come in. Think about also like where you live. Like, there's some places, in our province where the crackling fire would be okay for students to come into. And there are some places where that would create a trauma response because of the fires that we've had. So really working with them about how do you want your learners to feel in your presence and in your classroom. And then really diving into the honorable harvest, helping the learners understand how we are in the world really makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. I think also, when I get to go to schools and hear from the learners, or they take me and show me their gardens that they're growing, or if they don't have garden space, what they're growing in the window boxes, it's so exciting to me because they learn about life. They have this tiny little seed that then they can take either lettuce home or peppers home or tomatoes home to their family. And some of those seeds don't grow. Like there's just so many, right? And then what happens when all of the tomatoes are done and the plant begins to go brown? Well, do we trim it all the way back and see what happens in the spring when there's more light again? Like there's just all these pieces that then, if a young person's going through a difficult time, the educator can say, remember when we had that plant and they were in a time of darkness and we just loved them? And then when there was more light, they began to, it's like, the light will come again. Be easy with yourself. The light will come again. So there's so many things we can learn from the plants and all the beings that I feel like I don't even know 1% of 1%. Right? Like, truthfully. And so I think that's part of the beauty of doing courses with people is because then they're sharing stories and it's like, oh, thank you for that gift of that learning. Right? So it's not, I think it's really beautiful.
So what kind for you in writing this book and working with Robin's work and then in sharing this work with educators and young people and anybody, what for you has developed and grown? What learning have you had from this work?
Oh, I think my greatest gift is my friendship with Robin, because for me, every significant change or any writing edits, I always asked her, like, is this okay? Because I only had a third of the word count, so a huge part, of the manuscript had to be left for when the reader reads the original manuscript. So those decisions, I couldn't say cut, right? Those were big decisions, and everything went back to her. That was so important to me. So I think that relationship over the years, our friendship, is one of the greatest gifts for sure. And I feel like in that, my responsibility is to not only share like her wisdom through this book, but to share her love through this book so that young people fall in love with the earth herself again.
That makes a lot of sense, that people need to be in love with something in order to care for it.
And as you look through here, every chapter has an illustration. And I went to Santa Fe. That's where Nicole Neidhart, the illustrator, was living. And I went and spent a week with her and her family. And we sat at the kitchen table. We went to coffee shops. And we really went through every single chapter and like intentionally, what do we want the illustration for this chapter? So that sometimes the illustration will tell a story unto itself. Yeah, that was an immense gift to be able to.
Well, and I like that about this book, is that it's got all of this beautiful information in it, but then it does have these little prompts that makes you pause, and it has these little illustrations, and all of those things actually give you an opportunity to pause and reflect in a way that you don't always get when you're just reading a text.
And the beautiful piece she did, the illustration she did for the Thanksgiving address, is just so powerful. And I know that there are a lot of early childhood centers that have this up on the wall because the way she has illustrated it, it allows for children as young as, 3 or 4 to have that conversation of like, what are you grateful for today? Oh, look, strawberries, the starfish. Look over here, the orcas, the wind, like somebody's hands to hold. So her illustrations, she's incredibly gifted.
They're very beautiful. And what is her background?
Nicole is Denny.
She is,
Yeah.
okay. Right. She's from Saskatchewan as well?
No, she's from Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, there's that connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I feel like looking at that, it just strikes me, looking at the Thanksgiving address, it strikes me how, like, regardless of reading the book, that page alone is almost potentially all you need if you have young people in your life.
And to help, I think even for myself, like I was doing a writing workshop yesterday and I read this at the beginning and I was like, let's go around and like talk about what we're grateful for. Because it changes again when we get inundated with so much happening in the world. And it's like we're living in this time when we can feel the angst of the earth. Like we can feel her and she's shaking way more. And then all that's happening. And then we're in here. And it's hard not to let all that energy misguide us or take us away from gratitude or love or joy or happiness or hope.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, the more opportunities we have to pause and come back to those emotions and those kind of conversations, the healthier it is for our brain, which means it's healthier for us.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so you've talked about a lot of healthy approaches, right? Having the gratitude, but also being outside, being in the elements, being with nature. And you even talked about, I was imagining like, well, what about, you know, inner cities and places where children don't have access to a lot of green space, but you mentioned the little box in the window and growing. Do you get very many people in your courses about this work who are from the inner city?
For sure, yes.
Yeah. And is that kind of a piece of it?
I think it's an important piece in having those conversations. Well, how do you bring the outside in? And how do you get outside? Like I really dream one day in education, the conversation will be, when do we get to go outside? But when do we have to go inside? Mm-hmm. Right? That children are outside. Because when we're outside, like out here now, that first 1.5 inches of the earth's floor is called humus. And when we smell her, it automatically lowers that stress hormone cortisol and increases our dopamine and oxytocin, which are both the love hormones, but they're the belonging and the connection hormones. Mm. So when we're outside, our stress goes down and our ability to connect, to feel like we belong, to care, to be civil, and to love goes way up. So why wouldn't we be outside more? Right? Like,
yeah, that should be a foundation of education. Mm-hmm. Yeah, or of just life, daily life.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for getting me outside for this great conversation. Yeah. So I think we'll wrap up.
Okay. Do you want me to read the Thanksgiving address?
I would love for you to. Yes.
Now I closed. So actually, you know what? Before I read the Thanksgiving address, let me find this piece that Robin wrote so beautifully about the gift to be able to use the Thanksgiving address. Mm. I have heard the Thanksgiving address in many forms, but I'm not a Haudenosaunee citizen or scholar, just a respectful neighbor and a listener. Because I feared overstepping my boundaries and sharing what I had been told, I asked permission to write about it and how it has influenced my own thinking. Over and over, I was told that these words are a gift of the Haudenosaunee to the world. When I asked Onondaga Faithkeeper and Haudenosaunee citizen Oren Lyons about it, he gave his signature slightly bewildered smile and said, "Of course you should write about it. It's supposed to be shared. Otherwise, how can it work? We've been waiting 500 years for people to listen. If they'd understood that Thanksgiving then, we wouldn't be in this mess." So that's where the permission comes from, to be able to share the Thanksgiving address. So this is a very condensed version. Sometimes orators will do it in 2 hours. Let us bring our minds together as one, as we send greetings and thanks to each other as people. In these gathered faces, we see that the cycles of life continue. Let us bring our minds together as one, as we send greetings and thanks to our Mother, the Earth, for she gives us everything that we need for life. To the waters of the world that nurture life for all beings, and all the fish life in the water. Let us bring our minds together as one, as we send greetings and thanks to the vast fields of plant life, the berries, the trees, and the medicine herbs of the world, to the edible plants we harvest from the garden, especially the three sisters. Let us bring our minds together as one, as we send greetings and thanks to the beautiful animal life of the world, and all the birds who move and fly about over our heads, to the powers we know as the four winds, who purify the air we breathe and help to bring the change of seasons, to our grandfathers, the thunder beings, who live in the west with their lightning and thundering voices. Let us bring our minds together as one, as we send greetings and thanks to our eldest brother, the sun, our oldest grandmother, the moon, and the stars who are spread across the sky like jewelry, to the enlightened teachers who have come to help throughout the ages. We now turn our thoughts to the Creator, or Great Spirit, and send greetings and thanks for all the gifts of creation. Now our minds are one. So that's the Thanksgiving address. You're welcome. Thank you.
As you were reading, it occurred to me that I think there are a few more questions that I'd like to ask. Do you mind?
No.
Okay. Because just talking about Robin, or hearing Robin talk about permission, it's just making me think a little bit more about how what we're talking about in this book is Indigenous knowledge. You mentioned that everybody has an ancestry where people were connected to the land. And this day and age, it seems like, especially in Turtle Island, North America, that there's a lot of conversation around Indigenous knowledge and wisdom and returning to that. And also, I think a lot of people who are uncertain how to interact with it if they're not Indigenous. So could you talk a little bit more about how this information, how this knowledge, how this wisdom is important for all of us, and why, and also how do we connect with it in a responsible way?
Yeah, I do think all this wisdom is available for everyone. And I think one of the responsible ways is, yes, reading books, listening to podcasts, seeing movies, listening to audiobooks, visiting community members and elders. I also think one of the other responsible ways is to explore our own ancestries and to think about, no matter where we come from, if the house needed to be cleaned, like, when you walk into a house and you're like, if the house needed to be cleaned, how did the Scottish elders do that? How did the Irish elders? How did, those who had come to Australia as visitors initially, how did they, in their teachings, do that? So I think that we can learn from the Indigenous wisdoms and teachings and weave them into our life, not incorporate them necessarily, but weave them in. And if somebody asks you where you learned that, then you always give credit to who taught you that, or what nation you were on when you learned that gift. But also that we understand that we all come from this wisdom. It might be quite a ways back, but we all come from this wisdom. And I think that's part of why, I think I said this at the beginning, that's part of why I think with Braiding Sweetgrass and many Indigenous books, there's a resonation for people, because somehow they see themselves, maybe not through some of the experiences, but there's the wisdom, the care, the love, those teachings around respect, honesty, courage, humility, they resonate with people. And when they don't, then that's when we know those who are, we need to find ways to bring them in, right? Not shun them, but how do we bring you in? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I suppose this work is one of those ways.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I think about, going into high schools and talking about loving the earth and loving trees and loving listening to the ocean, it's a bit of a risky time sometimes but I'm always surprised at how much I see the young people change.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because they remember. They're way closer to remembering than we are.
Like change in the course of?
Even 40 minutes.
Really?
And like I was in a school in Chicago, And I always start with 1 minute of nature sounds before I introduce myself, and then 1 minute. And I think it was the ocean. So in Chicago, right, that's a sound that many may not be overly familiar with or hear often. And you could just see, it was grade 11 and 12s, and you could just see kind of the sitting back in the chairs, the heads, the eyes drooping a little bit. And then when question time came, one of the young people said, "Thank you for that. We all have finals next week, and there's a lot of stress in our school right now." Mm-hmm. And he said, "I could feel myself relaxing for the first time in weeks."
Really?
So it's a reminder, it wasn't me, it was nature, right? Like, and so even if we're in a place where we can't hear, but we can have it on a TV, we can have that sound, we have ways to bring her in. We can grow food, we can have plants. Makes a big difference.
Fantastic. Yeah. So bring her in. Find your ways.
Bring her in. And if you can, please get out.
Exactly. Not out of here.
Yeah.
Stay here.
Outside.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Danielle.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another year of the People's Food Summit. This is our 5th year presenting people at the front line of the creation of resilient food systems. We are talking today to Sophia Murphy. Sophia is the Executive Director of the IATP, is the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. Sophia is a food systems and international economy expert, and her work focuses on resilient food systems and international trade. Sophia, you worked with several civil society organizations, with intergovernmental organizations, universities. You hold a PhD in resource management and environmental science from the University of British Columbia, Canada. And Sophia, it's a pleasure to have you here. We've known each other for a bit now, and we know and admire the work of IATP. And first of all, you're a great example. Your organization is a great example of the importance of research into resilient food systems. And I'm going to be honest, we always wait to hear and read your latest publication. This is a great resource for us, for community organizations, for civil society organizations also working towards resilient food systems. And welcoming you and wanting to know more about IATP. What does your daily work involve? What is the research like? What's your interest? And what makes a food system, in your opinion, resilient? So welcome, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's such a pleasure to be here. And as you say, we have a particular and long history between IATP and a lot of partners in Mexico. So there's an additional joy to being able to talk about this. So the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy is almost 40 years old. It's a non-governmental organization, and it was founded at a moment of political and economic struggle in the US over trade. And it was at the time that the NAFTA agreements were being negotiated, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and also these so-called Uruguay round negotiations that led to the creation of the World Trade Organization. And the important thing about the founding that matters to our resilience was it was also a time when a lot of governments rewrote the social contract between the government and farmers, and between the government and the food systems more largely, and pulled out. And I think Mexico underwent similar changes in the late 1980s and 90s, where the government withdrew from a lot of its role in managing food systems. And there was a heavy reliance put on markets and an openness to companies, foreign or national, to taking charge in the private sector of things that had been in the public realm. So 40 years on, IATP is, we do research, as you say. I often say we do synthetic research, meaning we actually are looking at what other university and sort of research dedicated spaces are doing. And we're looking with a political eye to what the policies we are interested in are, and trying to make sure that in our political work, because the second, a huge important facet for IATP of our work is that we work in social movements, we work as part of networks of NGOs, we're engaged all the time in conversation with others. So what is it that our political analysis is identifying, and where would research help us? What are the facts? What's the science? And how do we make sure that we're well informed? And then that third piece of work from research and political engagement is then the policy interface. What is it we want to change in the world around us, around the institutions or the rules that govern us at whatever level? And IATP is working locally in our state, which is Minnesota, and in the sort of middle and north of the United States. It's also national as part of networks in US and regional with North Americans. And we have an office in Berlin that is focused also at the European Union level and looking at some of the transatlantic dynamic. And finally, we're engaged globally in a number of the multilateral networks. And in each of those spaces, rules are being created, norms are being set, and we're trying to bring an argument for a resilient food system there, always in partnership, always working with others. I want to make one final note, is that we are increasingly, and especially now at a time where our government is very unresponsive in the United States, I think globally we're seeing a reversion to more authoritarian, less tolerant government. At this time, we're also increasingly joining those who are focused on narrative. What are the stories we're telling? How is it we can challenge some of the myths that keep us in an unsustainable food system? And how can we retell a story that puts resilient food systems at the center of what we do?
Thank you so much, Sophia. This is great. Synthetic research, you called it, and that's wonderful, because that's often what we need when we are working in grassroots movements and grassroots building and community building. A lot of that is very helpful. That idea of creating research that is more, I don't know if digested is the right word, but something more accessible, and that we can use also for the narrative creation, which is so important for movement building. You talk about this private public and how that had changed over the years. Have you seen, and what is your perception on the changes in the US in the past 10 years or so?
Well, I should first of all say I'm an immigrant, and so I have a perspective on the U.S. that doesn't come from having been born and raised here. I moved to the United States when I was 30 years old, which is not quite 30 years ago, but a long time ago. And I haven't lived here all that long, 7 years, and then I left and came back 5 years ago. And a lot of the time in between, I was in Canada, where we have strong opinions about the United States. So it's a long preface, but I would say that I did then have a perspective of living in the US at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, leaving until 2020 when I came back. And I do think the country's changed, but it is and has been a country that always had a very strong commitment to a market rather than a state intervention, whose government is huge. It's, spends more money than any other government in the world, I think, but it's not spent in ways that a lot of other countries take for granted. A lot of certainly industrialized countries who expect to see the government in their safety nets and regulations and standards and so on. The US is very present. The government is present, but not in the ways you might expect, and especially around this idea of social protection. The US spends more money than any other country on healthcare, but to less effect, with less good result than anywhere else, because it's somehow resistant to the idea that health might be a right rather than something you have to earn and pay for yourself. So there's always been that streak of the market will do it, individuals will thrive, the state is a problem rather than a solution. But I think we now see it taken to a very extreme level, where not only is the state not spending public money on public good, but it's actually capturing that money for private interest in a more market way. And I think that one of the tasks I see for us as a movement, and for IATP as part of it, is to reclaim the whole idea of taxation, and not to see that as a punishment or a burden, but actually an opportunity, if you like, to vote, to have a say. here's my money that I put into the collective good, and what do I want to see from that? And at the moment, what we see is support for a wholly unsustainable kind of agriculture and built-in resistance to the kind of adaptive change we need in the face of climate change. That, you know, the insurance programs and the loans the government, or the grants also the government would make to agriculture, are locked into systems that are actually counterproductive for the changes we want. And I feel that instead of trying to reduce the tax burden, we should be claiming our tax and then making that a rallying cry. But it's others will tell me that's a very long haul fight in this country. It will take a while to change people's minds. But I'll just say climate change, you know, deny it as our government now would or not. Farmers are not denying climate change. They all are struggling to manage the very rapid changes in their growing conditions. And of course, that's complicated for them by trade and the disruption of trade markets at the same time, willfully by the government. And so I think there is a great moment of reassessment now going on. And I hope from that we'll be able to demonstrate better ways forward for food systems that won't rely on the same waste of public money and the same dependence on export markets instead of more domestic and regional food system.
Thank you, Sophia. You know about the resistance we have put up in Mexico against the introduction of genetically modified corn, which we have managed to stop for 12 years with a class action lawsuit. What is your opinion and the opinion of progressive groups in the United States about this battle?
So, as you perhaps know, IATP, my organization, has been very strongly supportive of this fight, and we're so, pleased and proud of what Mexico has been able to achieve, especially in refusing to accept that somehow a U.S. GM crop producer's desire to sell something should come above all of the public interest and concern that Mexico has exhibited, as well as the science and other things that they've brought to bear on why these crops are problematic. I think in the U.S., it's a very large and insular country. I don't know to what extent everybody knows about it. I think anybody who cares about genetic GM fights knows about this and is glad to see Mexico resist. And I think that the thing that might be changing within the U.S. is more around the growing health concerns with glyphosate, which is also something that Mexican civil society has brought to our attention and that the Mexican government has been upholding, and also, of course, in Europe. But the fact that there are the health issues associated with glyphosate and the ecological damage, I think that also is changing some of the sensibility, perhaps not around genetic modification, which in general was accepted by the broad U.S. public, but the specifics of those particular crops and how they're used. And I would also say that the way in which the companies forced GM products in a kind of lock-in of technology also created a lot of resistance here. And I think that persists. The mistrust of the companies involved in the production and diffusion of GM technologies remains a problem for them and creates some sympathy in the public here.
Thank you, Sophia. And I think that, that brings me also to another more personal, if you wish, question. But you were telling us earlier how your perspective from Canada, how you moved around. I also know you lived in Australia for several years. You clearly are a citizen of the world. So in your life, because some of the folks that we interview, that we talk with, they were lawyers, and that's their angle, and that's how they got interested in right to food from a legal framework. But what was your personal experience? I know, you can be take as long as you want or not, but what was your role? What took you to start thinking about food systems, about food resilience, about food systems transformation, but also what have you seen change what we noticed, and you were just mentioning, is that there's been a change of awareness in the general public. Maybe they're not talking about, GMOs. Maybe they're not talking about CRISPR technology, but there's clearly a recognition of the fact that what you eat affects your health, and that's becoming a more and more common conversation, I think, everywhere. So food issues are more present than they used to be before. Is that the case in your experience? So it's a twofold question. What took you to where you are? What was your interest? How did you get here? And what changes have you seen in terms of general awareness, which often has to do with the type of work that we do?
Yeah, those are important questions. So I would say, in terms of my career, I started in, what we could call international development cooperation. And my first work was actually in Canada, but it was around the Rio Earth Summit. I started work just in the last year before the summit was held in Rio in '92. And I was in a Canadian organization that was bringing together global NGO leaders to plan what were called the NGO treaties. It's a piece of the history of the Earth Summit that a lot of the civil society that came obviously were trying to influence and affect the treaties that were signed there, but they also looked at each other and said, this is our opportunity globally to come to some agreement on things. And that's probably where I first heard the term sustainable agriculture, although at the time I was facilitating the meeting of the treaty process and not anything in particular. And from there, I went and stayed in multilateral work. I worked in Geneva briefly with the UN non-government liaison service. And so I was really interested in this question of how do we agree as countries what to do, this intergovernmental thing, maybe because I didn't feel particularly that I had a country, but was interested in multiple countries. And when I came to the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, that was when I first really worked, strictly on food. And I came to really be the analyst on the World Trade Organization and the Agreement on Agriculture. But I very quickly got interested and concerned about the right to food, the role that agriculture played, and also this dissonance between what the US did and what the US said it wanted from other countries. And it was really clear in food, and I think has only gotten louder, and for many countries, that what they want to do in protecting food security and protecting agriculture, it's very normal government behavior to want your food system to thrive somehow. And at the same time, to be this aggressive presence in a trade negotiation where you're saying we have to export, nobody should protect their imports, there's this, even the same countries will be pushing their exports at the same time as they're defending, some vulnerable sector of their food system. So I was really interested in that. And then at the same time as that was all going on, La Via Campesina was emerging, and Via Campesina was beginning to define some concepts like food sovereignty. They were also gradually, but you could say quickly, over a space of a few years, coming to this slogan, WTO out of agriculture, and a very firm no engagement strategy. And we argued a lot at that time, just as people in a movement where IATP was not saying no. Obviously, the movement should say what it should say, should represent what farmers want. But we were arguing that somewhere you needed some rules, and somewhere you needed a space where other governments were involved. And where could we do that? Like, how would we have that conversation? Because a lot of farmers depend on trade, even if only for a small part of their income, and for some, though, it's all of their income. You can't wish away these borders, and we can't wish away some of the food structures that are there. Anyway, we had those long discussions, and I at the time wasn't sure about sovereignty and how do you negotiate sovereignty intergovernmentally. But I've come very strongly to support food sovereignty and see it now as, because of the politics of it, the assertion that we have a voice is so important. And as long as we accept then that we can't always have our way, we have to compromise. That's what democracy is about. And I hold on to that notion of food sovereignty as part of our resilience. I can move into the part 2, because I think to be resilient, a system needs to be adaptive. And to be adaptive, you need feedback. And the more feedback you have, the better your adaptation will be. And in the market, the only feedback is what you buy. Feedback comes from those purchasing power. But if you build your food system in a different way, then you allow more feedback from more actors. And in our current system, for example, farmers have very little chance to feed back because they're trapped by companies who control the markets, too few and not competitive. And then in some cases, they're controlled by the government policy, and yet they fight to be heard in the government and to have their interests taken into account above those of companies, corporations that are also in the market. So if you want a resilient system, it has to be adaptive. If you want to be adaptive, it has to be democratic in some way. And the market can be, if everyone has purchasing power, that's a great feedback loop. But you've got to make sure the precondition is set. And I think what has happened and changed, so many things have changed. The simplest way to say what has changed is that when I tell people what I do, they don't look at me kind of blank, not really understanding its relevance. They're all excited to ask me about GMOs or soil health or pesticide residue or whatever it is. People have, or even just what diets are good diet. And I think people have kind of taken back food as being central to life. And I find that very hopeful, because the first thing you want is for people to ask questions. And for a long time, I think people were treating, in North America, at least in the US, Canada too, really, like your food was fuel, just calories to get you going. But I think the joy of food production, that the resurgence of interest in urban gardening and smaller efforts and of just growing something that you eat, and the resurgence of interest in having schools have gardening and cooking, I think all of that is getting back in touch with the joy that food should bring. And then for me, that contains the grain of political engagement after. It brings a community together to talk about food. And from there, you're very quickly into political issues of power and voice and decisions over things like land and zoning, if you like, but where and how food should be available.
Sophia, what is the main challenge facing the United States in defending national and food sovereignty against the enormous power of transnational seeds and food companies that dominate their tables?
There's so many challenges, Mercedes, but I think what I will say is that the first big challenge that we are identifying now and working on at IATP is this idea that somehow the US feeds the world. This myth that I think is very strong, and that a lot of farmers hold that not as a duty. They're not boasting that they're the best in the world. They are feeling responsible that the production they're capable of is somehow crucial to others' well-being. And we want to challenge that and maybe change that purpose, because the truth is the US has become a net food importer. We spend more on importing food than we earn from selling commodity abroad. And we export non-food. We export animal feed and biofuel and a lot of industrial use, as well as some food, of course. But predominantly, we're not exporting food, and yet we're importing a lot of food. It's high value, fish and fruit and vegetables, and that is putting us actually in competition with food production in other countries and the use of land and water in other countries that may or may not be very food secure. So I think if we could challenge this myth, and if we could rethink what U.S. arable land is for, and I think if we could disentangle the food production from the commodity industry, that would be a huge turnaround that would allow us to rethink where the companies have captured a lot of the food system. But I think for now, if we don't change the idea that it's our duty to grow as much as possible of 3 or 4 things, it'll be very hard to challenge that power that those companies have.
Sophia, I got another question. Sorry, this is a very interesting conversation, and it's great to hear you. So the more you talk, the more questions we have, but not because you're not clear, just because it's so interesting, everything that you're saying. You were talking about democracy earlier. And my question here is, how can we, in such a globalized world, with all these global rules, trade policy, trade agreements that exist, is there any way for you, in your perspective, that we can actually democratize decision making? And I say this, at a local level, at a regional level, and hopefully at a global level. But that's kind of maybe too far to reach at any point. Can we democratize decision making in our food and agricultural policy, food and agricultural agenda? If so, what are the leverage points? How do you envision that happening?
So it's a very important thing for us, and it's new in the United States to be feeling so threatened with some of the basic things around, freedom of speech, freedom to articulate what we think is going on. So democracy is very front and center of our thinking at IATP at the moment. I would say we see it. One of our projects is actually just within Minnesota at the state level. How is an agriculture budget spent? How is education, environment, health money on food also spent? And how can we use that in a more systematic way to support a sustainable food system that is providing jobs locally, is making sure culturally appropriate foods are available to what is a very diverse population, that the kids are getting healthy food from the school lunch program. All of this is a kind of local level, state level discussion that is about integrating. And it's much easier at that scale to see how that might happen. And the democracy for us has been in making sure that, new immigrants who are also farming have a say in this, and that they're introduced to the state mechanisms and where the money is spent. They're all paying taxes. Where should that tax money go? And I think we also see that where the climate policy nationally was abruptly stopped by the Trump administration, there are a lot of local and even county, so sub-state level authorities that are looking at water quality or other things, and they're creating spaces where communities come together and they're talking about something that is not dividing them, but actually bringing them together. So another part of the democracy is it's always about compromise, but we have at the moment a politics that talks in very abstract terms, and we're trying to say, no, there's the people in front of you. What is it you want from one another? How do we share this space that we occupy? And then as you go through, I think, for me, it's another conversation. It's not IATP's specialty. Nationally, clearly, two parties for a country of this size that has allowed money to become such a big part of decision making, it's not democratic. Even within the parties are broken by structures that don't allow people, they don't see themselves reflected. And so the votes are complicated trade-off between the least worst, which is then leads to apathy, leads to people disengaging or to responding to stupid, but unfortunately beguiling kind of messages. So from leaders who are not responsible, not taking responsibility for the consequences of what they say. But I think there are ways around it, and there's a lot of deliberative democracy. There's a lot of models that I've heard about, Taiwan, other countries that are Ireland's experimented with this on specific issues. We need to build a habit of listening to each other and building compromise. And food would be a great issue around which to do that. I can't think offhand that it's been the basis of a discussion like that, but I think it really easily could be. Where do you want the food that your children are served at school to come from? And I think you could have a very cross-partisan discussion on that. And I will just put in a bid for the multilateral, because I do think that the UN Committee on World Food Security, or CFS, where IATP has been very active since its regeneration in 2012, or so, that space created a voice, a place at the table for civil society, and the mechanism now, the civil society and Indigenous peoples mechanism, it's a struggle as well, but it's a space where civil society is able to say, on this issue, this is what we think. And it allows us to debate and discuss among ourselves. And it also gives us a space at the table. And there are quite a few places in the UN system where that's true. It's true in the HIV/AIDS fund that is spending, trying to support people living with AIDS. And there are other examples, I think, where we need to keep pushing the experiment. But maybe at a time where governments are not agreeing, there's more room, not less, to have more participants there. I will say that we've also seen a growth in the private company presence and the both direct and indirect influence of private interests. And I think we do also have to fight to protect the UN as a public space with a mandate to protect the public order.
So in that last part that you were mentioning, because we see that it's been a big issue for a lot of the movements working around agroecology and regeneration and so on. There's nothing new, the greenwashing and the corporate takeover. So in your opinion, a way to be able to avoid that is more participation. Is that correct? Not letting them get in there, or?
I think that it's a long discussion at the UN. It came up initially around something called the Global Compact, which I want to say was in 2000 or anyway around that time. And the UN was trying to say, look, everybody should sign this set of principles and then they can come to the table. And NGOs and civil society was saying, hang on, just because Nestle says that it respects the right to water, here's 6 places where they've been in fights with local organizations and local communities over water rights. The fact that they say this doesn't mean they do this. There has to be some accountability. You can't just say, well, I'm a good person, so let me in. And they have a vested interest in the outcome. We ought to be able to distinguish between that they're accountable to shareholders. It's completely fine. It's a model for how economics might work, but it shouldn't be confused with the public interest. It should be absolutely clear that their final responsibility by law is to private shareholders who want a return on their investment. And that makes them problematic in a space where we're saying, I want the return on investment to be the well-being of my children and my grandchildren and their grandchildren. And our interests aren't aligned. They may coincide, but they're not the same. So I think, and sometimes we get the argument that if you let civil society participate, then business gets in as well. And I want to say business is always there because they always have the ear of the government and they're always interested. They're always funding parties, always funding elections, always hiring lobbyists to follow outcomes. And you'll see them. Yarrow, the fertilizer industry will have its people in the UN trying to push for public subsidies to buy fertilizer. So if they're there anyway, then let's have formal mechanisms and rules that allow civil society a voice, but that don't just allow anybody in because they say they're nice people, but that actually ask you to demonstrate how your interest aligns with the UN, which is it's a principles-driven organization. It's not just a space for anybody to use. It actually has a vision and an ambition, and you have to demonstrate that you are wholeheartedly committed to realizing that before you come in. So participation, but with conditions.
Okay, I would like to thank you for your struggle and your commitment, and to say that the peoples and communities of Mexico and the United States are working together to defend our common goods, such as sacred seeds, traditional foods, and biodiversity. This gives up hope and strength. And we are also coordinating with other peoples around the world, as evidenced by the People's Food Summit. And thank you very much for this work, very important work. Thank you, Sophie.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure, and I agree. I think we are an instance of hope in a very troubled continent, that we're able to have been working together, continue to work together, and that we share the sense of sacred seeds, of sacred food, right to food. And so it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Sophia. I want to join Mercedes in thanking you. And we're very grateful that you're here, and we're very grateful for all the work that IATP does. It's a guide, and I deeply believe in this idea of working together, of hope, of solidarity. And this goes way across borders. We are all, human beings. We're all from all over the world, and that's what should prevail, the principles and the humanity. So thank you so much for all the work that you do. and looking forward to reading the latest publications from IATP. Make sure you guys follow everything that they do. It's a fantastic work. Thank you, Sophia, for all of your very informed but also very hopeful and nutritious information that you brought for us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Hola, hola, buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos al programa. Es un gusto estar aquí con mi colega y gran amiga Mercedes López Martínez. Mercedes es la representante legal de la colectividad demandante contra la siembra del maíz transgénico aquí en México. Es también directora internacional de Bioorgánica. Y Mercedes, pues va a ser un gusto poder platicar contigo el día de hoy. Y que nos cuentes un poco más acerca de ti, acerca de tu vida, y también pues estas distintas facetas que tienes en el trabajo, tanto en la defensa del maíz aquí en México como centro de origen, como centro de fuente de vida, como también de tus experiencias en torno a todo lo que es la agroecología, la defensa de la soberanía alimentaria. Entonces, en primer lugar, Mercedes, muy bienvenida al programa y pues queriendo aprender un poquito más acerca de tus luchas, de tu trayectoria y de tu trabajo.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Ercilia, por la bienvenida y la presentación. Ya hemos trabajado mucho, nos conocemos en el día a día de tantas luchas a nivel local, nacional, internacional, y comentar que, bueno, yo venía ya de toda una serie de luchas desde muy joven, trabajé mucho con los sindicatos, con temas de perspectiva de género, con mujeres, y pues viajé a Nicaragua cuando tenía pues escasos 22 añitos, cuando la revolución sandinista. Y pues ahí conocí a una amiga que me vinculó con Ronnie Cummins, un gran líder social, nuestro jefe, nuestro mentor, que falleció pues hace unos años, ya 3 años creo, ¿no? Que falleció Ronnie, y pues conociéndolo a él, perdimos la pista, lo volví a encontrar, y pues él me invitó a sumarme a este maravilloso proyecto, pues que es Vía Orgánica, con el rancho, un rancho escuela en San Miguel de Allende, Guanajuato, un rancho regenerativo con toda una serie de proyectos de captación de agua de lluvia en una zona semidesértica, de crianza de vegetales, de animales de granja sin químicos, sin hormonas, todo un proyecto de educación con cursos, con talleres, había un grupo de teatro con proyecciones, con invitación a la gente que ha ido creciendo y que no se quedó solo a nivel local, que empezó aparte de incluir a personas de las comunidades cercanas, personas jóvenes, en todos estos proyectos regenerativos que llevaron toda esta información y prácticas a sus comunidades, fue expandir con la gente que visita el rancho, tanto de San Miguel de Allende, de la Ciudad de México, de otros países, porque pues hay que decir que San Miguel de Allende es un espacio internacional donde confluyen muchas personas, pero también fue crear redes y crear movimientos. A mí Ronnie Cummins me pidió pues que me hiciera cargo de la oficina en Ciudad de México, porque pues sabemos que todo está centralizado acá, que me conectara con Greenpeace, con la campaña Sin Maíz No Hay País, y pues hemos crecido muchísimo. Hay que decir que esta es una lucha de equipo, de grupo, que habemos muchas gentes como tú, Ercilia, pues que estás a nivel nacional, sobre todo a nivel internacional, y que pues formamos redes nacionales como la campaña nacional Sin Maíz No Hay País, la Alianza por la Salud Alimentaria, creamos conjuntamente con otras organizaciones la Alianza por Nuestra Tortilla, somos parte del Frente Parlamentario contra el Hambre, Fracción México, luchamos contra la imposición de UPOV 91 que sigue detenida en México. Estamos impulsando un foro en el Senado de la República para el 16 de octubre, justo el día de hoy que estamos aquí en esta grabación, pues para que el maíz sea una política de Estado nacional. Y pues tenemos toda una serie de actividades, de luchas. Entonces yo tengo que decir que mucho de este activismo viene de nuestro líder inspirador Ronnie Cummins y de todo un equipo que después fundó a nivel internacional Regeneración Internacional. Fuimos a Costa Rica y todo un grupo muy importante con André Lu, con Vandana Shiva, con otros personajes pues fundamentales en la regeneración en el mundo. Y pues somos parte de Consumers International, de IFOAM, somos parte de varias redes muy importantes que están empujando toda esta regeneración del mundo, demostrando que a pesar de la depredación, a pesar del poder de estos grandes corporativos internacionales de alimentos, de semillas que se apropian de las mineras, estamos dando la resistencia, seguimos luchando y pues estamos conectadas a muchos pueblos, a muchas luchas de México, América Latina, el Caribe, de Estados Unidos, de Europa, de Asia, de África, de Oceanía. Entonces, bueno, pues esto es parte de la historia de resistencia que hemos dado conjuntamente.
Muchas gracias, Mercedes, por la historia, por el testimonio de este trabajo y mostrarnos justamente, ¿no? Desde lo local, que es el rancho Escuela Agroecológico de Bioorgánica, hasta cómo se va construyendo este movimiento, cómo se va construyendo este trabajo, ya a nivel de una solidaridad internacional en defensa de la soberanía alimentaria. Y en particular, también la importancia de trabajo que has desarrollado aquí en México alrededor del maíz. Y en ese sentido quería preguntarte, porque la campaña nacional Sin Maíz No Hay País existe desde el año 2007. En el año 2012, si no estoy mal, surge a través de un núcleo de organizaciones civiles, de distintas personas, una demanda colectiva contra el maíz genéticamente modificado, que es una demanda que se sostiene hasta el día de hoy. Evidentemente, en estos últimos años han habido cambios políticos muy significativos aquí en México, pero ¿qué crees que es lo importante? ¿Qué crees que es lo que no hay que perder de vista? Porque muchas veces los movimientos civiles y los movimientos sociales, cuando llegan parte de estos movimientos y se convierten en gobierno, las cosas pueden llegar a cambiar o cambian. Me comentabas justamente de la sesión en el Senado que se va a tener el día de hoy y de las luchas que se siguen dando. Si nos pudieras contar un poquito más acerca de eso, sí, de la importancia de un acompañamiento o de la importancia de que haya una visibilidad de la lucha en este momento y una relevancia que sea tomada inclusive a nivel gubernamental, pero la importancia de continuar.
Es una reflexión muy importante la que hace Cecilia, porque justamente, ¿no? Hay como diferentes ámbitos, diferentes luchas. Hay que decir que México tiene una situación, pues muy especial en el mundo. Yo me imagino que también, pues en Asia será el tema del arroz y en Europa, en algunos países, la defensa del trigo, ¿no? De sus semillas, de sus alimentos tradicionales, pero en México tenemos el maíz y pues el maíz que es para muchas otras naciones, digo también, es el principal cereal el que más se siembra y se comercializa en el mundo, pero para México pues y Mesoamérica y muchos otros países el maíz es alimento sagrado, que es base de más de 700 platillos, bebidas, que fue declarada la comida mexicana por la base de maíz como patrimonio inmaterial de la humanidad. Y tenemos la situación de que la gente no conoce, no valora esa gran riqueza, aunque comemos, desayunamos, cenamos y en medio seguimos comiendo maíz con el taco, con los sopes, con toda la serie de alimentos, el pozole, ¿no? Todo esto que se mantiene. Y entonces el riesgo de que hace 12 años se sembrara el norte de México con maíces genéticamente modificados movilizó a la gente. Nosotros, como bien dices, desde la campaña Sin Maíz No Hay País, pues veníamos organizándonos desde hace muchos años, muchas organizaciones campesinas. Hay que decir que la resistencia se da desde los pueblos, desde las comunidades que no han dejado, a pesar del abandono del campo y la falta de apoyo, no han dejado de sembrar la milpa, que es este sistema tan rico de maíz, frijol, calabaza, chayote, quelites, jitomate, tomate, hierbas medicinales. O sea, es una riqueza muy amplia y la gente sigue resistiendo y sembrando. Hay que decir que el maíz nos ha movido, nos ha articulado de una manera muy especial. Logramos desde sociedad civil, que es muy importante, como lo mencionas, decirlo, y pues aliadas con grupos, porque hemos hecho una articulación y una alianza, que es lo que nos permite sobrevivir con la comunidad académica, científica comprometida con la sociedad, estos grupos campesinos, grupos originarios que siguen luchando, estos grupos de personas consumidoras que defienden pues esta alimentación sana basada en la milpa que se está perdiendo, estos grupos también que teníamos que eran muy limitados de funcionarios, funcionarias públicas, y pues tenemos comunidad artística comprometida, cocineras tradicionales, varios chefs. Toda esta articulación pues nos permitió lograr que el Día del Maíz pues entre en las efemérides. Ahí la senadora Ana Lilia Rivera, que ha sido una luchadora social y activista de Tlaxcala y defensora de los maíces, pues llevó este Día Nacional del Maíz, que ahora es internacional. Hay que decir que se celebra en muchos países del mundo, que tenemos muchos eventos, y bueno, esto nos ayudó mucho a avanzar. Después ya, la demanda colectiva, también hay que decir que hace 12 años, como les comentaba o te comentaba, pues el gobierno de Enrique Peña Nieto estaba a punto de dar permisos para sembrar todo el norte de México con maíz genéticamente modificado e interpusimos la demanda colectiva. Por 12 años ha detenido esta siembra y hay que decir que ha sido emblemática también para lograr pues 2 decretos presidenciales que prohibían o regulaban que cada vez hubiera menos importación de glifosato, este herbicida que viene con los organismos genéticamente modificados, pero también había una cláusula muy limitada, el título 6, de que iba contra los maíces genéticamente modificados en México. Se echó abajo por las controversias del Estado de Estados Unidos contra México, diciendo que el gobierno de México estaba incumpliendo el TEMEC. Y bueno, pero se logró entonces trabajar y trabajamos como sociedad civil con grupos del gobierno y de la academia en las reformas a los artículos 4 y 27 constitucional, que no solo prohíben la siembra de maíz genéticamente en nuestro territorio, que es centro de origen y diversificación permanente, sino que hablan de impulsar pues toda una producción agroecológica, rescate de los maíces, pero ahí pues falta un reglamento, ¿no? Que aterrice esto. Hay que decir, y en eso estamos trabajando y luchando, hay que decir que hay una ley general de alimentación que logramos también ya con este gobierno, pero pues que está siendo frenada por algunas autoridades de la Secretaría de Salud actuales, que sabemos pues que tienen intereses, ya hay ahí antecedentes y elementos con algunos de los grandes corporativos. Logramos el etiquetado frontal, todo esto a raíz de el advenimiento del gobierno llamado de la 4T, con algunos aliados, aliadas desde el gobierno, pero también pues los intereses de estas empresas siguen pegando, ¿no? Siguen deteniendo, pues sabemos de las 2 trayectorias de los secretarios del ámbito agrario de México, el anterior Villalobos y el actual Verdegué, pues que tienen una trayectoria ligada al proyecto de agricultura industrial, a las transnacionales, y estamos dando la lucha, ¿no? Entonces, sí, mucha gente activista se fue al gobierno, han hecho cosas muy importantes como estos decretos, como el trabajo con las reformas, pero pues hay grandes obstáculos y hay grandes intereses conflicto de intereses de pronto de gente que venía ligada a estas empresas, pues que están en el gobierno y que hay que detener, ¿no? Pero también, pues para cerrar esta reflexión, hay que decir que hemos encontrado mucha sensibilidad en la presidenta de la República, que nos ha escuchado, que ha empujado y pues que tenemos que avanzar y seguir luchando contra estos servidores públicos, pues que no sirven públicamente, ¿no? Tendrían que servir a las empresas. O eso intentan.
O eso intentan. Gracias, Mercedes. Sí, y efectivamente yo creo que hay que entender, y es bueno darle esta perspectiva histórica a lo que ha sido la lucha de la campaña y de la demanda colectiva, justamente para entender cómo es que llegamos a estas reformas constitucionales, cómo llegamos, es decir, no es que fue de un día para el otro, ni que se le prendió la lamparita a alguien y que lo hizo, sino que evidentemente es un reconocimiento también de una lucha que existe ya, pronto van a ser 2 décadas que está esta campaña permanente, ¿no? Y en ese sentido, en sensibilizar a la población, en también educar, espacios como el que tú representas, que es el rancho de bioorgánica, tiene esa función. ¿Qué importancia le das a espacios de agroecología, de escuelas agroecológicas y en tu experiencia, por ejemplo, con algo que han llevado a cabo dentro del rancho, que es el diplomado de agaves? ¿Cuál es la función o la misión de ese tipo de programas?
Es un proyecto muy integral el que estamos desarrollando. Esto viene pues de esa visión de nuestro jefe Ronnie Cummins, que hablaba de que hay que ser activistas, hay que luchar, pero también hay que predicar con el ejemplo. Y justo el rancho de Vía Orgánica es un paraíso donde la gente puede llegar, hospedarse, aprender, participar, tomar talleres, pero también es un centro de aprendizaje y también es un centro que desarrolla toda una serie de proyectos muy importantes. Justamente este proyecto que mencionas del billón de agaves, pues es un proyecto muy integral. Muchas de las investigaciones y del trabajo en los ranchos, en toda esta zona del Bajío mexicano donde está instalado Vía Orgánica, en San Miguel de Allende, pero muchos ranchos de esa región, pues tienen el problema de la desertificación. Pero también hay que decir que no es solo un problema, se vio como una solución porque muchos de estos desiertos pues tienen una gran variedad de agaves. México es centro de origen de muchos agaves y bueno, también se cuenta con muchos árboles de mezquites y todos estos árboles, cactus, pues son muy importantes para capturar el carbono del medio ambiente, para regresarlo a la tierra, enriquecerla, humedecerla, poder avanzar, combatir el cambio climático que nos está afectando y pues demostrar a nivel de los hechos, pero también a nivel científico, con pruebas que se han hecho en Vía Orgánica y en otros ranchos y aledaños, pero también otros ranchos de Oaxaca. Se ha trabajado en Oaxaca, se ha trabajado en Jalisco con grupos que están desarrollando pues grandes extensiones de magueyes, por ejemplo, para producir mezcal, pero que son monocultivos y que no son tan ricos para justo tener un paisaje muy integral, recuperar esos mezquites, recuperar esos agaves y no tener estos monocultivos que no sean con químicos, que vayan acompañados por milpa, por árboles frutales, ¿no? Es integrar proyectos como el MIAF y esto ha permitido pues avanzar bastante en muchos sentidos en las comunidades, con la gente, redituar económicamente, porque hay que decir que el campo mexicano, las y los campesinos están muy mal, entonces este proyecto muy integral ayuda a no destruir el medio ambiente, a que tengan una economía muy fuerte y pues desde Vía Orgánica implementamos un diplomado, ¿no? El diplomado de agaves y mezquites que ha tenido 2 ediciones fue en línea básicamente, ya la parte presencial al cierre fue en el rancho de Vía Orgánica y pues tuvimos gente de muchos lugares de México muy interesadas en el tema, pero también pues gente de otros países de América Latina tomando este curso taller que fue muy integral, empezar desde toda la parte cosmogónica de los agaves, toda la parte de los cambios cuando llegaron los españoles, cómo se integra una alimentación y una serie de cultivos que van pues haciendo también parte de esta gastronomía actual mexicana, cómo empieza el proceso de industrialización, las afectaciones que hay para la economía, los campesinos, toda la serie de tratados que surgen, la demanda colectiva, una serie de elementos ya técnicos también, pues para reproducir los agaves, para tener estos paisajes intercalados, holísticos, la parte de la gastronomía mexicana con los agaves, el maíz, los mezquites y pues un cierre muy lindo y muy integral que tuvimos en el rancho de Vía Orgánica. La educación es fundamental. La información, hay que decir que pues fue muy pionero este esfuerzo y que estamos trabajando en este ámbito. La educación es fundamental y pues también decir que hemos impulsado muchas campañas como Vía Orgánica. Hicimos una investigación sobre varias harinas de maíz nixtamalizada que viene de Maseca, este gran corporativo que domina el mercado de Minsa, y encontramos que tienen contenidos de glifosato también y de transgénicos, y no se le informa a la gente. Presumimos que estas empresas están mezclando varios de los maíces importados que son para ganado, que son forrajeros y que vienen de Estados Unidos, son genéticamente modificados con las tortillas, y pues hicimos toda una campaña de denuncia y de exigencia de que transparenten y no usen esos maíces. Tenemos toda una serie de campañas para defender las semillas, la soberanía, el maíz. Desde la demanda colectiva contra el maíz transgénico recibimos el premio de la Fundación Pax Natura en 2024. Ahí Jane Goodall, que desafortunadamente falleció hace 2-3 días, nos mandó un mensaje y es parte de Pax Natura. Y hay que decir que estuvo en México este fin de semana y que integrantes de la demanda colectiva la entrevistaron y le regalaron una ofrenda de maíces. Entonces, esta es una lucha local, nacional, internacional muy fuerte, muy importante y que estamos dando desde muchos frentes. Yo no sé cómo le hacemos, somos muy pocas gentes, pero con muchas ganas nos articulamos y yo creo que lo que nos fortalece y nos mantiene y nos permite seguir luchando y deteniendo estos monstruos transnacionales, pues es la resistencia comunitaria, el trabajo comunitario y pues el trabajo de muchos hombres, pero también muchas mujeres que no se visibiliza y que estamos presentes en la lucha, ¿no? Entonces creo que esta transmisión de este quinto año de nuestra cumbre alimentaria de los pueblos, pues debe rendir ese homenaje a todas estas mujeres líderes, luchadoras, a nuestro jefe Ronnie Cummins y a Jane Goodall, que falleció recientemente, y mucha gente que nos ha acompañado en la lucha, que ya no está aquí, pero pues que su memoria nos ayuda a seguir.
Así es, Mercedes, muchas gracias. Muy, muy bonito lo que nos estás contando y efectivamente, ¿no? Creo que eso es lo que nos da fortaleza. Y tú traes esta mirada, ¿no? Me estabas hablando del diplomado de agave y esta visión de un modelo de agroforestería diverso, no monocultivo. Tú traes una perspectiva múltiple porque eres doctora en estudios latinoamericanos por la Universidad de la UNAM, pero a su vez tienes una gran especialidad en género. Nos contabas de tu trayectoria con sindicatos, derechos laborales, pero esta perspectiva de género que es muy importante y que tú siempre la enfatizas y le das el lugar que tiene que tener. En tu experiencia, ¿cómo está esa situación en términos de género en este momento en México, a nivel global, pero en México, más allá de que tengamos ahora una presidenta y que diga que con ella, ¿no? Que llegamos todas, pero en tu propia experiencia personal, ¿has visto cambios y alguna vez ¿Te ha afectado esto? ¿Has sufrido una discriminación? Cuéntanos si quieres un poquito, porque siempre creo que es importante traer esta perspectiva.
Sí, yo creo que todas, Ercilia, hemos sufrido muchas discriminaciones por el hecho de ser mujeres, ¿no? Yo en mi trayectoria, por ejemplo, como periodista, tengo 2 hijas, hay que decir, 2 hijas maravillosas, pero pues en una ocasión yo intenté y pasé un concurso para trabajar, por ejemplo, en la Gaceta UNAM, la Gaceta de la Universidad, y me quedé, fui el primer lugar, pero yo en ese entonces pues supe que estaba embarazada de mi primera hija y pues tú sabes que hay mucha discriminación de género, despidos por embarazo, y yo avisé después de pasar la prueba, ya cuando iba a entrar a la Gaceta, la directora era mujer, y le dije, oye, estoy embarazada, entonces voy a seguir trabajando. E inmediatamente me dijo, no, ¿sabes qué? Cuando resuelvas tu problema de embarazo, así nacemos, regresa porque pues no te podemos aceptar así ni pagar una incapacidad, cuando quien paga la incapacidad es el ISSSTE, en el caso de la UNAM, y pues por supuesto que no me interesó regresar. Entonces, bueno, en el movimiento, yo cuando ingresé a la campaña Sin Maíz No Hay País, digo, en los sindicatos luchamos mucho por las lideresas, tuvimos un diplomado para fortalecer mujeres líderes de sindicatos, y resulta que de estas mujeres tuvimos una eficiencia terminal del 95%, casi todas concluyeron, egresaron, escribieron un artículo, tuvimos una publicación y después se colocaron como líderes en Radio Chapingo, Radio Educación, en los sindicatos que venían, otras se fueron a trabajar al gobierno de la Ciudad de México con cargos en los institutos, otras se fueron al Parlamento. Entonces, este tema es muy importante, que creo que hemos avanzado mucho por este impulso, y te comentaba que cuando yo entré a la campaña, pues éramos mujeres la mayoría, pero a la hora de que íbamos a tener un evento, que hable tal, y puros hombres, ¿no? Que entre tal, que hable tal, y entonces yo empecé, oiga, no, que vaya tal compañera, que vaya esta otra compañera, pero ¿por qué? Y yo decía, tiene que haber mujeres, y me pregunta una compañera, ¿por qué? Y su mismo jefe, Armando Bartra, dice, ¿por qué? Ve la composición de la mesa, están ustedes, las mujeres, trabajando, y logramos. Hay gente que dice que es una payasada el lenguaje de género, pero lo que no se nombra no existe. Logramos entonces nombrarnos a las mujeres, entrar a las mesas, entrar a los eventos como líderes, hablando y siempre buscando el equilibrio. Yo creo que eso ha permeado mucho también, creo que ha habido mucha conciencia, y pues el hecho de tener una mujer presidenta, y no cualquier mujer, es una mujer preparada, con toda una trayectoria de izquierda, una trayectoria social, pues ha sido gran orgullo y gran satisfacción, con los bemoles que sabemos en un ejercicio de gobierno, pero esto ha impulsado mucho, y las niñas ya tienen otra percepción y saben que pueden ser científicas como Julieta Fierro, o saben que pueden ser presidentas, o saben que pueden ser defensoras de los animales como Jane Goodall, y entonces ya ven a sus referentes, ¿no? A muchas de nuestras compañeras, a muchas de las mujeres que estamos aquí, no las nombro porque somos muchísimas, pero creo que es muy importante tener esa referencia, creo que estamos cambiando la perspectiva, creo que es muy importante en estos espacios pues que se han rodeado de hombres, ¿no? Y si ahora analizamos las estadísticas del Parlamento, pues ya en el Senado ya hay equidad, ahora sí, y vemos que Lauritzel Castillo, que es mujer, que es una senadora de izquierda, pues está presidiendo el Senado actualmente, ¿no? Vemos que lo presidió Ana Lilia Rivera, otra gran luchadora, y vemos a actrices, y vemos a políticas, y vemos a Alicia Bárcena, y tenemos muchas mujeres como referente que están luchando junto con los hombres que se quieren sumar, y yo creo que esto es muy importante. Tenemos cambios, tenemos mucha esperanza, y pues tenemos una generación de relevo muy importante en la lucha a favor del maíz, chicas, chicos, chiques, jóvenes que están luchando, que están avanzando, y eso nos da muchísima esperanza pues para seguir consolidando el poder comunitario, el poder de los pueblos, y decir que vamos a seguir luchando. Y pues feliz día de la alimentación alternativa, Ercilia, muchas gracias por estas entrevistas, muchas gracias a Regeneración en todo el mundo que va a estar proyectando este día, y pues estamos en el rescate de estos espacios alternos.
Muchísimas gracias, Mercedes. Muchas gracias por tus palabras, por tu participación. Y doy fe de que la generación de relevo, tú has sido una pieza clave porque te veo diariamente cómo impulsas y cómo apoyas y cómo acompañas a mujeres jóvenes en sus titulaciones, en el consejo, en el día a día. Entonces, personas íntegras, solidarias y como tú, la verdad es que son claves en este movimiento. Muchas gracias, Mercedes, y seguimos en el Día Mundial de la Alimentación.
Gracias, seguimos.
And I'm going to really enjoy boiling and eating one of these. I think there is a hopeful future because it seems that your government is going to ban the planting of genetically modified seeds to keep the purity of your native maize species. The last book I wrote is called Seeds of Hope, and there's 2 chapters in which, and there's photographs of your different mazes, and so I'm very well aware of your fight. And there's a group called Pax Natura, and I think you've heard of them, and they've made this film that's going to be played. Yes, so I know all about it, and I've been, in fact, I think there's an interview with me in that film. Well, it was, I always want to do things that will help nature and help the people fighting for nature. Well, everybody should be involved because it's the world of the future that we're fighting for. And it's the people of today who must fight for the future of the people of tomorrow. And we must fight now. We must not leave it too late. And we're reaching a point of no return. We must not let that happen. And that's why I have this program for young people, Roots and Shoots. You're eligible for that program. Well, it's not just chimpanzees for me. When I was young, it was all animals. I happened to be given chimpanzees to study. And I have studied hyenas and all sorts. And in this book I wrote, Seeds of Hope, I learned about maize. I learned about plants around the world, trees I love. I will fight for nature, not just chimpanzees. I will fight for nature. And that includes maize. It includes chimpanzees and dogs and cats and cows and pigs and horses and humans and, all of it. We've got to fight for everything because it's all interrelated in these ecosystems. So that's why Roots and Shoots is so important, because young people around the world, they're choosing to work to save the environment, to save species, to save what they care about. Well, I think this Day of Maize is very important. It will call attention to what Mexico is doing to save its natural heritage. Your natural heritage is the environment of Mexico. The fact that corn, maize originated here is really important to protect those original seeds like these. And I'm going to really enjoy boiling and eating one of these.
Hello, happy World Food Day. I'm Alexis Badenmare. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association, and I am here with David Johnson and Wei Chin Su, and they are the inventors of a bioreactor compost maker that produces superlative compost that grows vegetables and crops better than any other compost, right? Can we say that's true?
So far we can.
If the approach is correct, it is a whole system approach though.
Yeah.
It's not magic.
So it's called the Johnson Su bioreactor, right?
Yes.
And then you also have a program called BEAM. What does BEAM stand for?
It stands for Biologically Enhanced Agriculture Management. And like Wei Chen was saying, it's a system that you're restoring. The microbial community is part of it, but it's a little different way to farm. A lot more profitable, a lot better for your soil, and more sustainable in the long run.
And probably manages water better, right? It makes it
That also.
the soil.
If it's done right, yes. Yeah. Because as biologically enhanced, that you break it into two components, and biologically enhanced agriculture management. So the first part is the Johnson Su bioreactor is more like an incubator that you basically incubate the system to produce a very fungal dominant compost and very biodiverse, microbial diverse compost. So it's more of an inoculant instead of just compost. Yeah. Then you apply it in your system and in a way how you manage your agriculture system appropriately. And the best way to do it is regenerative agriculture practice.
Oh, of course. Of course. Well, just describe briefly, and I know that there are a lot of tutorial videos available online. So if anyone wants to see how to create a Johnson Su bioreactor, I know we have information at the Regeneration International website. You all have a YouTube channel, and when I Google you, tons of videos come up. But just describe briefly what a Johnson Su bioreactor is.
Well, it's a little different approach to composting it. We use a bioreactor. It's basically just a cylinder made out of wired and landscape cloth. And it's like 4 foot diameter, 5 foot high. And we put tubes in the center so it's never more than a foot away from ambient air as you fill it. Mm-hmm. You fill it and you soak the material, pile it into the bioreactor, and then after 3 days, usually you can pull the pipe out. You have ventilation all the way. You're never more than a foot away from ambient air, so it's always aerobic.
And I want to jump in there to say that because this incubator, Johnson Su bioreactor, that is no-turn system, is 100% aerobic. But it takes 1 whole year, 12 months. If you do it right, that it takes 12 months enable for the system to become mature. And I often use the example as gestation period. that, different systems have different maturity period. And so just because if you heat it up or if you water more or whatever you do, it doesn't mean that it will mature earlier, just like human baby. If you are lucky enough to carry the baby full term, 9 months, that's going to be a healthy, beautiful baby. But anything earlier than that, you're hoping that the baby will survive well because the prematurity. And so there is definitely a drawback. But in any case, this system takes 12 months. So when David talking about using the wire, make sure it is per spec in the instruction, because those are wire mesh. And wire mesh, like the type of material they put in the concrete foundation for reinforcement. So there's rigidity, there's stability, and it also is placed on top of a pallet. So there is air in the bottom and then infiltrate